today on Strangest Remains, a French museum filled with skinned bodies. Chang and Eng, the first Siamese twins. The grave robbers who became medical specimens. The story of the surgeon and the giant and the fight for his skeleton. We'll see the mysterious Hand of Glory. And look at the tragic life of the Elephant Man. All this and more on Strangest Remains. Rest in peace is a common enough epitaph, but for many people buried in 19th century Edinburgh, it was a wish that was not granted. On dark nights, shadowy figures worked among the graves, digging up freshly buried corpses. They were the body snatchers, although their ability to raise the dead gave rise to the nickname resurrectionists. Strangely, the practice was actually encouraged by respectable surgeons such as the eminent Dr. Robert Knox. As one of the foremost anatomists of his day, the doctor's classes in Edinburgh were always packed. Up to 500 eager surgeons would watch him perform dissections in this very lecture theater. His problem was finding enough bodies for these demonstrations. This price list shows what students of the day paid for the privilege of cutting up a fresh corpse. Officially, each medical school was only allowed a corpse of one executed criminal each year. But unofficially, body snatchers carried on their sinister trade to make sure that supply met demand. Of course, people were outraged and took steps to protect their deceased loved ones. Some buried them in mort safes, graves surrounded by iron bars fixed deep into the ground. Others used self-sealing iron coffins that could not be broken into. But the most infamous body snatchers, Burke and Hare, were not so much grave robbers as serial killers. Both Irish, they came to Scotland to find work and met in 1826. They lived in squalid lodgings here in Edinburgh's run-down Westport area. Their first victim died here in this lodging house from natural causes, owing Burke £10. Desperate to retrieve the debt, Burke and Hare took the corpse by cart to Surgeon Square and to the doctor's home. Knox knew better than to ask questions and paid the pair £20, indicating he was interested in more acquisitions. So rather than wait for sick lodgers to die, Burke and Hare suffocated healthy men and delivered their bodies to the doctor's back door. New victims were lured to parties hosted by Burke and Hare. They were plied with whiskey and then murdered. Victims were in no condition to put up a struggle. Before delivery, the bodies were locked up. But one day, two new lodgers hurried to the local police station. They had found a fresh corpse carelessly hidden in their own room. Burke and Hare were arrested and held here. Hare agreed to testify against Burke in return for immunity. The trial lasted one day, and Burke was convicted of murder. This is a drawing of him and his wife just as sentence was passed. Burke was hanged before 25,000 people on January 28, 1829. He confessed to 16 slayings. Ironically, William Burke's fate was the same as that of his victims. His body was publicly dissected with these instruments by Dr. Alexander Monroe, Dr. Knox's main rival. This is Burke's death mask, cast just after he was cut down from the gallows. You can see the rope marks on his neck. And this is his skeleton, which now stands in mute testimony to the ghastly crimes he committed. Some of his skin ended up in private collections. Charles Dickens owned a piece, used it as a bookmark. Here you can see incisions made by Dr. Monroe while dissecting Burke's skull and removing his brain. This is a model of it, cast from Burke's cranium. Apart from his bones and death mask, Burke left another legacy in a word he gave to the English language. Even today, Burking is a term for suffocating a victim without leaving a mark on their body. But what of Dr. Robert Knox? Although exonerated, he was forced to flee to London, the rhyme about his involvement still ringing in his ears. Down the passageway and up the stair, out and in with Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox is the boy who buys the beef. Incredibly, the man that encouraged Burke and Hare to murder 16 innocent people in Edinburgh got away scot-free. This is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, home of the Mutter Museum at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. Most institutions have a few skeletons in their closet, but here at the Mutter Museum, thanks to Thomas Mutter, their benefactor, they have hundreds of them. In 1856, Dr. Thomas Dent Mutter wrote to the college that ill health was forcing him to retire his post, and he wished to offer $30,000 and his unique collection. When it arrived, the college discovered Mutter's unique collection consisted of over 2,000 examples of medical technology and curiosity. After years of documenting, the college opened its doors to the public. For over a century, this gallery has been home to some of medical science's strangest and most gruesome artifacts. This is a plaster cast of conjoined twins born in 1870. They survived for 13 months. They quickly became a medical curiosity, visited by hundreds of people every day. Doctors would continually send interesting specimens to Mutter's collection whenever they came across them, like this skull, which was from a field hospital serving the Battle of the Wilderness during the Civil War. Sadly for this soldier, the doctor had no trouble determining his cause of death. The bullet passed completely through his skull. This wall of skulls from 19th century Bosnia, containing 139 skulls, demonstrates some extraordinary variations in skull structures. This wax sculpture is of Madame de Manche, the unicorn lady, who lived in early 19th century Paris. She lived 80 years before doctors learned how to remove the 6-inch horn sprouting from her forehead. This man complained that he only had a bowel movement every 4 weeks. Doctors diagnosed him as having a simple enlargement of the colon and sent him home. The man died a short time later. After an autopsy, doctors discovered why. This is the man's colon. It is 8 feet long and weighed over 40 pounds. At its widest point, the colon has a circumference of nearly 2 feet. Now filled with wire and straw to keep its shape, the colon is preserved in this case as a warning to all trainee doctors of the perils of misdiagnosis. This fearsome exhibit is perhaps the most chilling item on display at the museum. This gruesome mass of tissue was donated in 1874 by Joseph Leidy. He called her the Soap Lady. Her corpse has not an ounce of fat on it. That's not due to regular workouts. It's because every ounce of her fat has turned to soap. During the relocation of a local graveyard, hundreds of rotting bodies were exhumed. When the laborers conducting this grisly task came across an even more fearful corpse than the others, it didn't take long for Leidy to hear about it. He concluded that a rare chemical reaction in the soil had turned the woman's decomposing flesh into this brown, fatty substance, similar in composition to soap. The process preserved much of the detail in her flesh. The skin on her feet still hangs between the joints of her skeletal toes. On her hands, you can still see wrinkles at the joints, and here on her head, flaking flesh mingles with her white hair. Once safely delivered to her new home, scientists began conducting tests on her, including this remarkable series of X-rays. In this X-ray, doctors spotted this metal pin. Analysis of the pin determined the Soap Lady must have died in the early 1800s, meaning the metamorphosis had taken just 65 years. Nobody knows the true identity of the Soap Lady or how she died, but buried alongside her was a soap man. Long since separated, we can only hope the soap couple slipped into the next world together. This eye-catching wall of molds of eyes shows just some of the terrible and painful fates to have befallen a number of patients. From the everyday to the horrific, from the unfortunate to the truly gruesome. Gretchen Worden is the director of the Mutter Museum, responsible for keeping the collection up to date. But she's taken a special interest in two of the college's older residents. Chang and Eng, the Siamese twins, studied here at the college after their deaths. This plaster cast was made after the autopsy. Their bodies were returned to their families in North Carolina for burial. The boys were born in Siam in 1811, joined here at the chest by a band of skin and cartilage. At the age of 17, Chang and Eng were earning money performing gymnastics for anyone who'd pay to watch them. Their curious appearance soon took the brothers to audiences around the world. An entrepreneurial manager invited them to America, where he presented them on a grand tour. They became known as the Siamese Twins. With their new billing, the brothers built a career being exhibited in all the best venues around the world. This is a special double-seated chair Chang and Eng traveled with. The twins performed daily shows in which they demonstrated feats of strength and displayed their connecting band to sell-out audiences.
After a while, they accumulated enough money so they were able to retire, and they liked the area of Mount Airy, North Carolina. So there they settled down, they bought land, they married sisters, and eventually had 21 children. They lived on separate farms so that each man could be master of his own house. After the Civil War, they were of course loyal Confederates. They lost a great deal of money in the war, and they had to go back on the tour route in order to recoup and try to support their families. And it was during that time that Chang, who is on the right-hand side, suffered a stroke. And that for the last 5 years of his life, he was more or less incapacitated and had to be slightly helped around by his brother Eng. And so in 1874, in January, they were doing the routine move from one house to the other. During the night, Eng woke up sometime later and discovered that his brother Chang was dead. And several hours later, Eng followed. And today we think that he simply bled to death, since his brother's heart was not returning the blood to his body, even though it was a superficial circulatory connection.
As surgeons at the Mutter Museum performed the autopsy, the Siamese twins finally experienced the one thing that eluded them during life: separation. This photograph was taken immediately after the operation, in which doctors discovered only a simple procedure had been needed to separate the boys. Stained yellow by formaldehyde, these are Chang and Eng's livers, clearly visible as the thin band of tissue that connected them. Chang and Eng's display here has inspired a further exhibit looking at the history of other Siamese twins. These are the North Carolina twins Millie and Christine McCoy. Born into slavery, they were just 2 years old when they were taken from their family and forced into circus life. These are the Tocci brothers, Giovanni and Giacomo, born in Italy in 1877. But it is the original Siamese twins who attract most attention here at the Mutter Museum. Despite trends to remove the more unsavory articles, Chang and Eng remain on view for doctors to study, and so the public may understand how medicine continues to advance for the benefit of everyone. In a city which boasts attractions such as the Liberty Bell, for the Mutter Museum to have so many visitors proves there's a part of everybody interested in body parts. This is a typical scene of 18th century London, one of the most prosperous cities in Europe, and a center for free thinking, especially in the arts, sciences, and politics. Some of the greatest names of the time are remembered by their legacies. The poems of William Wordsworth, the oil paintings of Joseph Turner, and the pioneering electrical experiments of Michael Faraday. A great philosopher and supporter of social reform was Jeremy Bentham. This is Jeremy Bentham, stuffed and preserved, wearing his best clothes, sitting in University College London, where he can still be seen by visitors to the school he helped found. Bentham was a prison reformer and campaigner for women's rights and the welfare state, and was also rather odd. He bestowed a knighthood on his cat, who he then called Sir John Langbourne. He was equally fond of naming inanimate objects. He called his teapot Dick, and his favorite walking cane Dapple. In his will, Bentham left his entire estate to the university, providing he was dissected in public, stuffed, and put on display. He said this was a far better way of being preserved for posterity than a mere painting or a statue. His will also insists he attend the annual Board of Governors meeting. To this day, Jeremy is given his place in the boardroom where he is recorded present, but not voting. An Egyptian tomb, deathly still for centuries, the air trapped inside since the high priest slid the last stone into place over 3,000 years ago. Hieroglyphs tell of the jealously guarded secrets inside, often protected by a curse, extending its power since the days of antiquity to intrude on the fears and superstitions of the present day. Such a curse carried off Howard Carter, discoverer of the famous tomb of King Tutankhamun, or King Tut, in the Valley of the Kings. Yet the explorer presses on, always hopeful of a new find. Explorers have been tracking down the treasures of the ancient Nile civilizations for 2 centuries. Fresh discoveries are rare. So what is a museum to do if it wants to expand its collection of Egyptian artifacts? In San Jose, California, amidst the high-tech of Silicon Valley, the Rosicrucian Museum has the finest collection on America's West Coast. This mummy was the child of a wealthy family. The black substance covering his face is resin. This slender body really was a mummy. She was the lady of the Tuher house, who died in the year 663 BC. And this intricately decorated sarcophagus contains the mummy of a priest called Nisimen. No Egyptian tomb would be complete without a menagerie of animal companions, and the Rosicrucian Museum has many in its collection. This baboon shows the astounding amount of love and craftsmanship that went into making an eternal friend. It wasn't necessary to mummify the whole animal, which was fortunate for the artisan who had to preserve this bull's head, the only one of its kind in the world. Smaller mummification projects of the time included cats like this one, perfectly preserved inside its reed basket after more than 2,000 years. And this fish, possibly the proud trophy of a pharaoh who wanted to take his catch with him into the next world. Extensive as the collection is, there was a time when the museum wanted to expand. But where would you look if your museum needed a mummy or two? For the curators of the Rosicrucian Museum, the answer was simple. When they wanted to buy themselves a Christmas gift of 2 ancient sarcophagi or mummy cases, they turned to a mail-order catalog, Christmas special edition, of course. Neiman Marcus prides itself on being able to offer the perfect gift. For Christmas 1971, they were selling a range of specially selected his and hers gifts, and alongside the jewelry and clothing were a his and hers mummy case, matching set. While other museums scoffed at the idea, the Rosicrucians of San Jose gladly wrote out the check and mailed off their order. These are what arrived. The sarcophagus of High Priest Usermontu, dated from 630 BC, accompanied by the sarcophagus of a female noble, Ertarau, dating from the 3rd to the 5th century BC. Both cases are in excellent condition, the colors and the intricate hieroglyphs still bright after more than 2 millennia. After a period of uncertainty, being bought by a department store and then sold on as Christmas gifts, these artifacts had now found a suitable home. For the sarcophagus of Usermontu, however, the story was not over. While it was in transit, it was noticed that the case seemed to rattle. This is what was inside. When curators opened the casket, they discovered they had an unexpected bonus gift, a mail-order mummy, the High Priest Usermontu himself. Amazingly, neither Neiman Marcus or the previous owner, rumored to be a member of the English aristocracy, had opened the case to discover Usermontu's existence. Now he is on display at the museum so that students of Egyptology can study the incredible results of the Egyptians' skillful embalming process. Usermontu is in such good condition that fragile tissue, like eyelids, have been preserved. His teeth have also survived well. If not well kept, notice the wear on the upper molar, giving vital clues to Egyptian diet and lifestyle. The only parts of his body to have suffered over the years are the toes on his left foot. But even the breakage allows us a valuable look at a cross-section of mummified flesh. The most amazing thing about Usermantu was discovered when he was unwrapped. Usermantu has had knee surgery 2,500 years before such technology was believed to exist. Scientists from Brigham Young University in Utah examined the leg. First they took x-rays, then they drilled through the bone to allow access to an arthroscopic camera for a closer look. This is what they discovered: a silver pin. Amazingly, the pin uses the same biotechnology as modern medical practices. The corkscrew-shaped sterling silver implant is designed to be attached to the still-growing bone. This technology was only recently rediscovered. An extensive series of tests made on tissue surrounding the pin led scientists to believe that this surgery had been done while Usermantu was still alive, without anesthetic. For now, the Rosicrucian Museum considers its collection complete. Much work still remains to uncover the secrets of Usermantu and his surgery. However, the curators know that a time will come when they need to expand further, but they're not worried. There's always Christmas to look forward to. Let's visit Paris and the world's most macabre museum. In 18th century France, one man carefully skinned over 500 dead bodies, preserving them in this bizarre state by injecting their veins, arteries, and organs with his own special serum of dye and embalming fluid. All in the interest of science, of course. The man responsible was a veterinarian turned anatomist, Monsieur Honoré Fragonard. He began by experimenting on animals. Horses were his favorite specimens. He perfected this technique on them before moving on to bigger and better things. No one asked where the bodies came from, and Fragonard kept few notes. Despite being a professor, he wrote very few medical papers in his life, preferring to lock himself away in his laboratory, working tirelessly with his scalpel and secret embalming fluids. His only company, the company of the dead. Although he was an intensely private person who put his work before everything, Fragonard did find time away from his experiments to court a beautiful young Parisian girl. They were to be married, but she tragically died. It's rumored that he skinned and preserved her too in this most famous work, the Chevalier Anatomique. A startling testament to his grisly skill. This horrific collection caused public outcry 200 years ago. Today, those who managed to find the little-known Museum of Zoology, Pathology, and Anatomy in Alfort are still stunned by it. What chilling fascination does it hold for us? Maybe it's because, although we don't want to look, we just can't help ourselves. We have to stare into the face of death. This sweep of foreboding land, now England's Moors National Park, is the home of Danby, a village in which one very bizarre legend lives on as it has for hundreds of years. You're safe to visit now, but 16th century Yorkshire was riddled with danger, especially for the criminals. Harsh local law dictated that the punishment was often far more severe than the crime. Execution, in fact. With such effective deterrence, villains would often concoct some very strange methods to aid them and hopefully avoid capture. One of the strangest was conceived here at 600-year-old Danby Castle, close by the National Park's Visitor Center. It's the last place you would expect some of the most desperate of Yorkshire's criminals to be loitering in their spare time. It was not simple morbid curiosity that led these criminals to this hanging tree just across the road from the court. Yorkshire legend had it that the right hand of a hanged man possessed magical powers, so they came here to sever the hand from a freshly swinging corpse. First, they dried the hand in the sun, added a candle made from the dead man's fat, and the end result was a fully prepared hand of glory, ready for use. And here it is, the only surviving example in the world, the rotting flesh barely hanging on to the dried bones. So how is it used? Casing a pub owner's wares during the day, the villain returned at night dressed as an old lady. He asked to sit a while by the fire until finally the publican snuffed out the lights and went to bed. The villain then produced the Hand of Glory and lit the candle, reciting this ancient spell. Let those who rest more deeply sleep. Let those awake their visuals keep. O Hand of Glory, shed thy light. Direct us to our spoil tonight. Everyone in the house magically fell into a hypnotic trance. The pub owner awoke the next morning to discover he'd been robbed and the thief was safely across the moors. The Hand of Glory was so successful that the criminals decided to move on from robbing pubs and started experimenting with other venues, the last of which was here at the parish church of Danby, near the River Esk. Due to its remote location, it was a tempting spot for the thieves. In order to protect the valuable sacraments, the vicar was always very careful to lock up after the service. This was a job for the Hand of Glory. Attending the service, all the while planning their raid, the group of brigands took their places here at the back of the church. Their aim was to leave the hand hidden on a pew. After the service was over, they remained in the graveyard, waiting until the coast was clear. Meanwhile, inside the now empty church, the Hand of Glory would spring into action, leaping off the pew and crawling its way along the floor, intent on unlocking the door from the inside. Unfortunately for the villains, who expected to be let in, they found themselves left out in the cold. The legendary Hand of Glory had not performed as planned. When the vicar opened up his church the next morning, he found that nothing at all was amiss. Although he did find the Hand of Glory here on this pew, right where the villains had left it, waiting to leap into action. Nowadays, it can be seen at the museum in nearby Whitby, where Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. And glorious stories are preserved forever, here on the North Yorkshire moors of England. This is the famous Royal London Hospital, where one day in 1884, the surgeon, Sir Frederick Treves, heard a commotion outside his study window. The street was packed, lining up for a freak show being held in a vacant building. Today, it's this butcher shop. But 100 years ago, it was Joseph Merrick who was on display like a piece of meat. Merrick was known as the Elephant Man, because as a child he had a growth looking like a trunk hanging from the roof of his mouth. It was commonly thought it happened because his mother had been startled by a circus elephant whilst pregnant. Treves took Merrick to the hospital for an examination, giving him a room on the 5th floor. Hospital archives record his admission in 1886. For the first time in his life, Merrick could walk freely and enjoy the relative privacy of its secluded garden. This is Merrick's skeleton on display at the hospital's Medical College Museum. It's one of the most unusual pathological specimens in the world and rarely seen by the public. Evident are the huge tumors that grow around his bones and the advanced curvature of the spine, making him a truly pitiful sight. Merrick wore this cap and veil to conceal his terrifying appearance from the general public. From recent CT scans and X-rays, it's now believed he suffered from Proteus syndrome. This very rare genetic condition causes abnormal growth of the bones and soft tissues. These are casts of his right arm and foot. His left arm and hand were normal. His fingers in particular were quite delicate, and he was able to make full use of them. An example of his dexterity was this model church which Merrick built as a gift for an actress of the time. Although never knowing true love, he struck up friendships with several lady friends of Treves and wrote to them regularly. After living at the hospital for some time, Merrick regained the dignity that had been cruelly denied him. He soon became the toast of London, visited in his room by the cream of Victorian society. His greatest joy came with the visit of the Princess of Wales. who became a regular visitor. The disease continued to take its toll. He was growing blind and deaf. His deformities were getting worse. As his head grew heavier, Merrick had to sleep sitting up to support it. But in 1890, in a desperate desire to be like other people, he slept on his back, and the weight of his skull suffocated him. Joseph Merrick's untimely death at 28 was national news. It was Treves' painful task in the name of science to dissect the man who had become his dear friend. Merrick died never once asking for pity or complaining about his affliction. He was an inspirational example of humanity, which is best expressed in this poem he wrote. Was I so tall, could reach the pole, or grasp the ocean with a span, I would be measured by the soul. The mind's the measure of the man. John Merrick, the Elephant Man. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But some of us want to preserve our bodies after death. Others have no choice, yielding to natural or supernatural forces once they pass away. Consider the incredible story of Bernadette Soubirous, or as she's known today, Saint Bernadette. Born in Lourdes, France in 1844, Bernadette came from a peasant family. At 14, something was to change her life and the lives of millions of others. In a rocky grotto, a radiant vision of the Virgin Mary appeared before Bernadette, bathing her in a brilliant glow. She was transfixed, calm and unafraid. The apparition appeared on several more occasions, eventually telling Bernadette about an underground spring with special powers. Local people began to visit Lourdes, claiming that the spring had remarkable healing powers. In 1862, the Bishop of Lourdes issued a decree confirming the Immaculate Mother of God did appear to Bernadette. Fleeing the unwanted attention, she traveled 400 miles here to the town of Nevers, where she entered the convent of Saint Gildard and became a nun. She distanced herself from the miracles she witnessed, never speaking of the holy visions, but devoting herself to caring for the sick in the convent. A symbol of healing, Bernadette could not heal herself. She died in this chair in 1879, aged 35, and was buried here in the convent grounds where a replica of the Lourdes Grotto was constructed. Like the original, it became a place of pilgrimage. In 1909, Bernadette's body was exhumed for reburial, and there was a startling revelation. Although she had not been embalmed, Bernadette's body was in perfect condition. This is Saint Bernadette, unblemished. Her expression is serene. To the Church, her body untouched by decay was proof that the girl from Lourdes was truly a saint. Today, over 5 million people make pilgrimages to Lourdes in France, hoping to benefit from its healing powers. Bernadette remains here, in Nevers, enshrined in a precious crystal coffin, looking exactly as when she died in 1879, over 100 years ago. It's the second miracle of Lourdes. This is Paris, the City of Lights. A city famous for its joie de vivre. But deep beneath Paris is another city. A sinister warning marks the entrance to that city, known as the Catacombs. Stop. Here is the Empire of the Dead. Beyond that sign, you'll find the mortal remains of over 6 million people. In the 1780s, the city fathers decided to build houses over the cemeteries, so they dug the bodies out of their graves and reburied them down here in the old stone quarries beneath the city. The bodies were disinterred in the dead of night. The bones were piled into funeral carts and then carried through the city accompanied by priests singing the burial service. Every night, the funeral carts rolled through the streets and delivered the bodies here to be stacked in 200 miles of tunnels 82 feet below Paris. It took a year just to empty the Church of des Innocents, the first of the cemeteries. Then it was the turn of St. Eustache and St. Landry and all the other old burial sites scattered throughout the city. Night after night, the dead kept coming to be stacked away. Subsequently, long walls were made entirely from their skulls, and deep ramparts of thigh bones stretch into the distance. People created macabre patterns from the remains, using human skulls and bones, making doorways, archways, and altars of bone. The catacombs, one of the world's most chilling sights, a monument to death and human mortality. Eerie, macabre, desolate, overwhelming. Truly, a city of the dead. Today, in the city above, there are some 2.5 million people. Below them, in the dark, in the city of the dead, there are 6 million people. The catacombs, largest city of the underworld. In 1983, 2 workmen in Cheshire, England, accidentally dug up a body. It had been buried in peat, an excellent natural preservative. Forensic scientists identified the body as being female, aged between 30 and 50. The victim had been strangled. The noose was still around her neck. By the state of the corpse, this looked like a recent murder. The police announcement of this gruesome discovery was a welcome relief to Peter Rainbart, a local man. Burdened with guilt, he confessed that the body belonged to his ex-wife, whom he had strangled in 1960 and buried nearby. He was convicted of her murder. Case closed. Or was it? In the meantime, 12 similar bodies had been discovered throughout Europe. All of the victims had been strangled and buried in the same type of soil. This looked like the work of the same man, now behind bars in England. Except Peter Rainbart had never actually set foot abroad. Chester police ordered a further examination of the body to establish the time of death. The results were incredible. All the other bodies showed similar findings. The earliest victims had died almost 3,000 years ago in 850 BC. The murder Mr. Rainbart confessed to took place in 210 AD. It seems they were all ceremonial killings carried out by the Vikings. Many men have gone to prison for murders they didn't commit. Peter Rainbart was jailed for confessing to a murder that took place 1,700 years before he was even born. This is the story of someone who was terrified of dying, and someone who couldn't wait for him to die. It's the story of the hunted and the hunter. John Hunter, one of 18th century England's leading surgeons, who got his medical knowledge by dissecting human corpses. Hunter would even threaten to kill colleagues to get his hands on a fresh body. He always got his man, and the Irish giant was to be his biggest prize. This giant was an Irishman named Charles O'Brien, who stood a towering 7 foot 10 inches tall. Hunter was obsessed with obtaining his body by fair means or foul. In 1782, O'Brien arrived in London and settled in Piccadilly. He made a small fortune being billed as the tallest man in the world. Crowds flocked to his house, paid an entrance fee, and gawked in wonder. One such visitor was John Hunter, who parted with the chilling words, "You have a year or 2 left to live. Will your body to me?" "Never!" cried O'Brien, fleeing his home. He sought refuge here on Cockspur Street. But that didn't stop Hunter, who stalked O'Brien relentlessly. He would wait day and night, staring at the giant's room, willing the Grim Reaper to do his deadly deed. He didn't have to wait long. In June 1783, O'Brien died aged just 22. His friends placed his corpse in a lead-lined coffin, which they planned to secretly drop in the Irish Sea. Unfortunately for O'Brien, Hunter followed them. That night, while O'Brien's friends rested, Hunter and his accomplices switched his body for rocks of the same weight. and took it back to London. Working through the night, Hunter performed an autopsy, then boiled the flesh off the giant's corpse in a huge vat in his basement. It's on display at the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons, close to the British Museum. And here it is, sharing a display case with the world's smallest person, who stood just 22 inches tall, less than 1/4 the height of O'Brien, whose proportions are truly phenomenal. O'Brien's skull is over 2 feet in circumference, and his feet are an incredible 15 inches in length. His thigh bone alone is almost 3 feet long, and the distance from fingertip to the wrist is 11.5 inches. Over 200 years later, John Hunter rests in peace, but his victim still awaits his final resting place. We are in the anatomy department at Liverpool University in England, where specialist Robert Connolly is about to carry out an autopsy. But this is an examination with a difference. You see, this body is old, very old.
As far as we are aware, this is the mummified remains of a young priest, priest of Akhmun, contemporaneous with Tutankhamun himself, so he's probably in the region of 3,000 years old.
Radiography was the first modern technique used to help understand the process of mummification, particularly when it came to removing the body's vital organs.
It was easy enough to remove the viscera, which were extracted, but to actually remove the brain must have been a rather more difficult problem, and none of the skulls have been cut open. They're all intact. And it appeared that they would push a probe up the specimen's nose, and so that a probe would go up the specimen's nose, and then they break out a piece of the bone at the base of the nose, and they can scoop the brains out, as it were, down the nose of the specimen which is being mummified. This is the skull of the mummy of Tutankhamun, and you can see there a fragment of bone which has been pushed from the base of the nose into the cranial cavity. Also, the other thing you can see here is that the mummy was laid on its back, and the back of the skull filled up with resin, and then it was tipped right up, and so you can see the different levels and the different layering at which the resin was used for the mummification process.
It might seem unlikely that scientists can tell a 3,000-year-old mummy's blood group, but it's possible because the substances that determine it are actually found throughout the whole body, not just in the blood. This is how it's done. A sample of mummy tissue is ground to a fine powder and added to modern red blood cells. Put simply, a change in the blood group of the new cells indicates the blood group of the original specimen. From the mummy's tissue, it's also possible to extract intact fragments of DNA to get a genetic profile of the body. Pioneering tests like these are currently helping to determine another of the mysteries of ancient Egypt. Just who was the true father of Tutankhamun? Like the riddle of the Sphinx, Egyptian mummies have kept their secrets for thousands of years. Only now is science being used to unlock their mysteries. Blood tests for mummies?